So just to kick off on the blanket bog side of things, obviously these peatland habitats, dominate these like the west of Ireland pretty much, and particularly from, I would say, pretty much from the likes of Lough Conn all the way out west, from Ballina pretty much all the way out the west, and like it's the most familiar habitat to us and familiar ecosystem to us, and it's very interesting because the way that they grow, they take in carbon from the atmosphere, the plants die, it grows at about 1 millimetre every year, and it takes in carbon forever, indefinitely once it's intact. So it'll take in the blanket bogs will take in about 1/4 of a tonne of carbon per hectare per year. So every hectare will take in of intact bog will take in about 1/4 of a tonne of carbon, and it stores it, So it's a huge carbon storage, and with climate change and all the rest, it's something that's very important. But when it's drained, or when there's a lot of drainage in it, it could lose maybe up to 6, 7, 8 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. So there's a big difference there as well. And similarly, where it needs an optimum. It needs to be intact, ideally, and it needs optimalised, I would say, grazing to a very good extent. Not too much, not too little, as to say. It's obviously very important from a biodiversity perspective, and that's what we hear most about. We hear most about the nature value and all of that. It's obviously very, very important from a water quality perspective as well, because it stores, and that's where most of our water comes through. So the better the quality of the habitats, the better the quality of the water quality. And in a project like this, we don't look, the peatlands are a focus of it, but we don't just look at, say, the biodiversity, or we don't just look at the water quality, we're looking at the climate side of things as well, and there's good reason for that when you look at it in the bigger picture. So, I'm just going to give a quick background to the results-based side of things here as well. I know there's some fairly handy tug-of-war lads in the audience this evening, so forgive my cartoon there, but there's a reason for that I'll talk about in a minute. But there's a little thing here about water and the water quality over the last 30 years. And it's very interesting because we've got 30 years of agri-environment schemes, from the beginning of GLAS. And in the last 30 years, we've had a 10-fold decline in the highest water quality in the country. So for every 10 rivers that we had of the best water quality in the country, we've only got one now. So it's a big decline. And that's because of changing land use types. The graph down here is the carbon emissions. So we know that the carbon emissions have gone up massively in the last 30 years. And we know then that the quality of our habitats, we know that only 15% of them are of good status. And none of our peatland habitats or wetland habitats, they're all in poor or bad status, inadequate or poor or bad status. And that period of 30 years has been a big crunch really, throughout. So it's not like that it just damages one thing or another. It has the whole thing becomes unbalanced. And what's the big driver behind that? People point fingers and whatever else. Well, it's ultimately policy. Policies incentivize one type of land use, other policies incentivize another, or seek another. So you've got maybe nature policies, you've got climate, maybe water policies pulling in one way, and in some instances you've got agriculture policy pulling in another, incentivizing us and telling us that we need to do this for our income. From a CAP perspective, because obviously the majority of our income, farming income, comes from CAP. And that's the idea of the tug-of-war side of things, that when you've got two policies that pull against each other, that's where you get the damage on the ground. And back to the red tape side of things, we know that, in one instance, one has been paid to get stock up there, the next instance there's, we're moving cattle from a certain area, the next instance we're moving sheep from an area, and that balance isn't good, and the ultimate result is damage on the ground. And to the point that, on the far little icon there is the report of the European Court of Auditors, and that was a review of the agri-environment programs throughout Europe, and assessed how well they worked. And we know that over the last 30 years, this report says it didn't work. And we know in Gloss, for example, €1 billion was spent, and we know that it didn't achieve what it needed to achieve. And that puts us in a vulnerable position, because if we don't achieve our goals in these, that there's the risk that the main majority of our farm income is related to that, and that could be in danger in future, in the next round of CAP in 2027 or whatever. So it's really important that we, that the schemes that are designed to work for the certain area, work for farming in that area, because farming in the area has been here an awful lot longer than the policies, the bigger policies, the big European policies, I would say, that have come in the meantime. So just the way, and this is just by way of background to our approach here, we have some really good examples of how things can be done very well. And there's the likes of the Burren programme, and later on, or more recently, we've got the Pearl Mussel Project EIP and the Hen Harrier Project EIP, and these are kind of locally led, and the likes of North Connemara EIP. These are locally led programmes that have worked really well, and farmers in these areas like these projects a lot, and they incentivise the types of practices that are usual to that area, and that's really important. And there's a couple of points that we just took from those, and I'll fly through them. Just being locally adapted, practical and results focused is massively important. The idea that we do things differently. The idea of a set of rules that apply to East Galway or Kildare or Westmeath or wherever, and Ballycoy or Undufnaven or wherever it might be, doesn't make sense. It's targeting and it's local adaptation is something very important. Obviously, as someone says, when we talk about the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, that farmers are the first responder to those. So the farmers on the ground know how to fix things if things are broken, and they're the best innovators of them all. So obviously working for and with farmers in these areas is obviously vital from this perspective. Fairly funded is obviously hugely important as well. It has to be properly funded and has to operate in a fair setup. And then the idea of flexible and adaptive management is another one that's up there. And this idea of flexible and adaptive management is we all do things differently. We have some might type, the gap with an old pallet and a bit of baler twine, and to others they mightn't think that looks good or whatever. If it does the job and it delivers what it's supposed to do, well, so be it. Who gives two hoots? That idea of it must be this height and it must be that wide and must be made of whatever it is, it doesn't make sense. Back to, I suppose, to the red tape to a very good extent. And that's where local been flexible and adapting to local management. Local trust is something that's massive, but capacity is a huge thing as well, of understanding how these programs work. And this is our only first time meeting generally, but the capacity is something that's very, very important, and that's what we'd hope to do. We're running until the end of this year, and then CAP, the new agri-environment scheme, is something that takes over from then. But ultimately, understanding and getting in at this point to know how these things work is hugely important as well. And probably one of the most important things for me is to be able to facilitate improvement. So the idea that you come in on a certain level, payment level, and you're like that forever is bonkers, because if you're doing a good job, if you do it, that should be a payment related to that. If you're doing a better job next year, up she goes. That should be improving and increasing. And then finally, accounting for factors outside the farmer's control is something that's important. Something that your payments relating to that, to something that's out of your control, would be unfair. And it's not like what it's about is just trying to get a program that works properly. So the idea of the results-based program is simple enough. The payment relates to the score. The higher the score, or the field, the quality on the ground, the higher the payment. It's as simple as that. Now, this is a pilot, so we have say a minimum payment of €800 and whatever on this, and whatever you score, obviously the payments related to that as well. but the minimum that one would receive is 800. So it's all underpinned by this scorecard, and we'll go through that in a minute. There's another aspect to this as well. That's something that's important is the idea that we need to be able to be adaptive to demonstrate and to make sure that from the European Commission's perspective and from the Department of Agriculture's perspective, that we're delivering for water quality, we're delivering for biodiversity, we're delivering for climate and carbon and all that kind of stuff. So that's massive, and it's really important that that's very clear and that's well costed and whatever else as well. So we don't look like peatlands as a focus for us, but your inside land, your bit of green land is as important nearly as your peatlands, because that's where you manage your stock, they come down, the land and whatever else, and that's hugely necessary for your overall farm management there as well. So it is whole farm. But a key thing in the overall project is the idea that we're not going out looking for bad stuff. What we're going out is looking for good stuff and rewarding that. And if there's poorer quality habitats or whatever it might be on the ground, we're there to, I suppose, incentivize the improvement of that and facilitate that. So that's the way it is. And it looks like, this is how it looks. The results-based payments are, well, what do I have to do for my results-based payments? You don't do anything for your results-based payments. Your results-based payments relate to your historic management, So if if it's in good nick and whatever else as well, it'll probably be a very good results-based payment, and that's it. That's your annual payment related to that. You don't do any actions for it as such. It's just the quality that's on the ground as it stands. But then we talked about this adaptability and need to be able to improve and facilitate improvement. And there's this supporting actions. It's like a supporting actions payment. It could be fencing, it could be putting in a bridge, it could be, John will talk about that in a bit, but it could be a lot of different things. And that's just allow you to do an action on the ground. It could be rhododendron control, for example, that we pay for with training. That's very important for some of them. And that will be something that you do a given year, and next year your score goes up and your payment goes up. And that's it. And that's the payment stream. So then, just lastly on this section, the one thing I'll say is that with the new cap from 2023, starting from January 2023, which is only 10 months away, there will be these cooperation projects, the ACM. So the new gloss as such will be what they call the cooperation letter, and that's going to be run by a local team, kind of like ourselves as such, and there'll be 8 of those around the country. There'll be, this one here is generally North Connacht, so it's on with Nathan out to an Erris and over as far as the Ox Mountains, So that's something that is what will follow on from this. So I suppose one big advantage here is that there's this program here running now, and it's a good opportunity to kind of be in, see how it works. If there's improvements that can be done on the ground, or you want to do on the ground, well, then so be it. And if you don't, that's your own business as well. So that's the flexibility, that's important. So that's pretty much that section.